Document. Part 5. The discovery of the well brought a wave of relief to the group, but it also marked a turning point in their journey. The water they had found was enough to sustain them for several days, giving them time to regroup and plan their next move. Yet, as they sat around the ancient ruins, sipping cautiously from their makeshift containers, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were still stranded in an unforgiving desert, miles away from civilization or any hope of rescue. Daniel took charge, sketching a rough map in the sand to outline their options. He pointed to the well, then drew lines radiating outward in different directions. One line led north, toward what he believed might be mountains, based on the faint outline visible on the horizon. Another line stretched east, where the terrain appeared flatter and more barren. A third line curved south, following the path of dried riverbeds that hinted at underground water sources. Though crude, the map served its purpose. It gave the group a sense of direction. CYX. Al leaned forward, studying the map intently. His glowing eyes flickered with thought as he traced one of the lines with his finger. After a moment, he gestured toward the north, mimicking the act of climbing. Daniel nodded, understanding immediately. The mountains offered the best chance of finding shelter, cooler temperatures, and perhaps even streams or springs fed by smelt. It was risky traveling through the desert, would be grueling, but staying put wasn't an option either. Resources were finite, and time was not on their side. VRN chimed in, holding up the blinking device. He pointed to it, then to the sky, making a series of gestures that suggested repairing their communication system once they reached higher ground. Zixel agreed, though his expression remained cautious. Lyra, who had been quiet until now, spoke softly, her voice melodic, yet tinged with concern. She pointed to herself and then to the bandage on her arm, shaking her head slightly. Her injury was healing, but the strain of travel worried her. Daniel understood her concerns. Lyra's strength was fading, and pushing her too hard could jeopardize her recovery and the group's chances of survival. He turned to Zixel, using gestures to propose splitting the load. If they worked together, carrying supplies and supporting each other, they could make the journey manageable. Zixel hesitated, clearly torn between protecting his team and pressing forward. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded, signaling his agreement. With their plans set, the group prepared for the trek ahead. They refilled their canteens and containers with water from the well, ensuring they carried as much as possible without overburdening themselves. Vieran repurposed parts of the wreckage into carriers, fashioning slings and harnesses to distribute the weight evenly. Lyra insisted on helping, despite her injury, and Daniel admired her determination. Even Zixel pitched in, his stoic demeanor softening as he worked alongside the others. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the group set off toward the mountains. The journey was arduous from the start. The sun blazed overhead, its heat relentless, while the shifting sands made every step feel like a struggle. Daniel led the way, his boots sinking slightly into the loose ground. Behind him, the aliens followed in single file, their movements deliberate and measured. Zixel stayed close to Lyra, offering support whenever she faltered. Vieran walked beside Daniel, occasionally consulting the blinking device, which emitted faint pulses of light. Hours passed, and the landscape began to change. The flat expanse of sand gave way to rolling dunes, their slopes steep and treacherous. Climbing them required effort, and the descent on the other side was equally challenging. At times, the wind picked up, sending grains of sand stinging against their skin. Despite these hardships, the group pressed on, driven by the promise of safety waiting beyond the horizon. Midway through the day, they encountered a new obstacle, a wide ravine cutting through the desert like a scar. Its edges were jagged, and the bottom was shrouded in shadow. Crossing it would require careful planning. Daniel approached the edge, peering down into the abyss. He estimated the distance, searching for a safe route. Nearby, Zixel joined him, pointing to a narrow ledge that zigzagged along the side of the ravine. It looked precarious, but it was their only option. Dotniel turned to the group, miming the act of walking carefully along the ledge. He emphasized caution, holding his hands out to indicate balance. The aliens understood, nodding solemnly. Zixel went first, testing the stability of the path, before signaling for the others to follow. Lyra hesitated, her fear evident, but with Daniel's encouragement, she took a deep breath and stepped onto the ledge. Slowly, one by one, they crossed the ravine, their hearts pounding with each step. When they finally reached the other side, exhaustion set in. They collapsed onto the ground, catching their breath and allowing their muscles to relax. Lyra leaned against Zixel, her face pale but resolute. Viren checked the blinking device, noting that its signals seemed stronger here. Perhaps they were closer to a solution than they realized. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, the group resumed their march. The mountains loomed larger now, their peaks dusted with snow that glimmered faintly in the fading light. The sight filled them with renewed hope, though the journey was far from over. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, and fatigue weighed heavily on their bodies, yet they pushed forward, knowing that giving up was not an option. By nightfall, they reached a rocky outcrop that offered some protection from the elements. They huddled together beneath the stars, sharing what little food they had left. Daniel handed out portions of dried fruit and nuts, rationing carefully to ensure everyone received enough. The aliens accepted the offerings gratefully, their glowing eyes reflecting gratitude. For a brief moment, the tension eased, replaced by a quiet camaraderie born of shared hardship. Lyra spoke softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. She pointed to Daniel, then to herself and the others, making a circular motion with her hand. Though her words were incomprehensible, her meaning was clear. They were connected now, bound by the trials they had faced together. Daniel smiled, nodding in agreement. He felt it, to the unspoken bond that transcended language and species. Before settling down to rest, Viren tinkered with the blinking device, attempting to amplify its signal. Sparks flew as he adjusted wires and circuits, his brow furrowed in concentration. After several minutes of trial and error, the device emitted a steady pulse of light, accompanied by a faint hum. Vron's face lit up with excitement, and he called the others over to see. Together, they studied the device, marveling at its newfound functionality. Though they didn't fully understand how it worked, the implications were clear. They might finally have a way to contact help if anyone was listening. Zixel placed a hand on Vrin's shoulder, offering silent praise. Lyra clapped her hands softly, her smile widening. Daniel felt a surge of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone after all. As they settled in for the night, the group took turns keeping watch, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The desert was vast and unpredictable, but they had learned to adapt. They had faced storms, hunger, and despair, yet they endured. And as Daniel gazed up at the stars, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This strange, desolate world had tested them in ways they never imagined, but it had also revealed their strength. Together, they had proven that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about finding hope, even in the bleakest of places. Document, Part 6. The night was cold and quiet, the kind of stillness that made the desert feel like a forgotten corner of the universe. The group huddled together beneath the rocky outcrop, their bodies pressed close for warmth. Daniel sat upright, keeping watch as the others rested. His mind wandered, replaying the events of the past days. From the crash landing to the discovery of water, every step had been a battle against the odds. Yet here they were, alive and moving forward. The blinking device now hummed softly, its faint light pulsing like a heartbeat. It was a small victory, but it gave them hope as dawn broke. The group awoke to the sight of the mountains, looming closer than ever. Their peaks were sharp and jagged, rising like sentinels against the pale morning sky. Snow capped the highest ridges, glistening in the sunlight. For the first time in days, the air carried a hint of coolness, a welcome relief from the relentless heat. Daniel stretched his stiff limbs and glanced at the others. Zixel stood at the edge of the outcrop, scanning the horizon with his piercing eyes. Viren fiddled with the blinking device, adjusting its settings while Lyra tended to her injury, rewrapping the bandage with practiced hands. With no time to waste, they set off again, their pace slower but steady. The terrain grew rougher as they approached the base of the mountains, the smooth sands giving way to uneven rocks and boulders. Each step required care, and progress was slow. Daniel led the way, choosing paths that seemed safest. He pointed out loose stones and slippery surfaces, using gestures to warn the others. Zixel followed closely, guiding Lyra whenever she stumbled. Viren brought up the rear, clutching the blinking device tightly, his expression focused. By midday, they reached the foot of the mountains. A narrow trail wound upward, carved into the side of the cliffs by centuries of wind and water. It was steep and treacherous, with sheer drops on one side and jagged walls on the other. Daniel hesitated, studying the path carefully. He turned to the group, miming the act of climbing and pointing to the trail. Zixel nodded, understanding the plan. Together, they began their ascent. The climb was grueling. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the thin air made breathing difficult. Daniel's legs burned with each step, and sweat dripped down his face. The aliens struggled too, their slender frames unaccustomed to such physical exertion. Lyra leaned heavily on Zixel, her strength waning with every passing hour. Viren paused, frequently, checking the blinking device to ensure its signal remained strong. Despite the challenges, they pushed forward, driven by the promise of safety waiting above. Halfway up the trail, disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind swept across the cliffs, sending rocks tumbling down the slope. One of the larger stones dislodged, crashing toward the group. Daniel shouted a warning, waving his arms frantically. Zixel reacted instantly, pulling Lyra back just in time. The rock missed them by inches, smashing into pieces as it hit the ground below. The group froze, hearts pounding, their faces pale with shock. For a moment, no one moved. Then Zixel stepped forward, his voice low and commanding. He gestured for everyone to stay close, emphasizing caution. Daniel nodded, taking the lead once more. They continued upward, their movements more deliberate now, their senses heightened. Every sound, every shift in the rocks, set their nerves on edge. Yet, they pressed on, knowing there was no turning back, as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Casting long shadows across the cliffs, they finally reached a plateau. It was a small, flat area surrounded by towering rock formations, offering some protection from the elements. Exhausted but relieved, the group collapsed onto the ground, catching their breath. Lyra leaned against Zixel, her face pale but resolute. Viren sat nearby, cradling the blinking device in his hands. Its light pulsed steadily, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. Daniel surveyed the area, searching for signs of water or shelter. He spotted a cluster of shrubs clinging to the edge of the plateau, their leaves dry but intact. Nearby, a shallow depression in the rock caught his attention. It was filled with rainwater, left behind by a recent storm. Though murky, it was drinkable. He called the others over, pointing to the pool and mimicking drinking motions. The aliens gathered around, their expressions lighting up with gratitude. They refilled their containers, savoring the cool liquid as it soothed their parched throats. With their immediate needs met, the group settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly, and the wind howled through the cliffs, biting at their skin. Daniel retrieved the blanket from his pack, draping it over Lyra and Zixel. Wrapped himself in part of the wreckage, his body trembling slightly from the cold. Daniel sat apart from them, keeping watch as the stars emerged one by one, dotting the sky with pinpricks of light. Despite the harsh conditions, there was a sense of calm among the group. They had faced countless dangers, yet they endured. Daniel reflected on their journey, marveling at how far they had come. These beings, who had once been strangers, now felt like companions. Their shared struggles had forged a bond that transcended words and species. Even Zixel, whose stoic demeanor often kept him distant, seemed to soften in moments of quiet. Lyra's gentle nature brought warmth to the group, while Vroon's curiosity and ingenuity provided solutions when all seemed lost. As the night wore on, Viaren approached Daniel, holding out the blinking device. He pointed to it, then to the sky, making a series of gestures that suggested amplifying its signal. Daniel studied the device, recognizing its complexity, but unsure how to assist. Viaren sighed, his frustration evident, but he didn't give up. Instead, he began tinkering with the wires, muttering softly under his breath. Daniel watched, impressed by the alien's determination. After several minutes of trial and error, the device emitted a louder hum, its light pulsing brighter than before. Vron's face lit up with excitement, and he called the others over to see. Together, they studied the device, marveling at its newfound strength, though they couldn't be certain if anyone was listening. The possibility of rescue ignited a spark of hope within them. Zixel placed a hand on Vrin's shoulder, offering silent praise. Lyra clapped her hands softly, her smile widening. Daniel felt a surge of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, their ordeal was nearing an end. He turned to the group, using gestures to suggest continuing their journey at first light. They nodded in agreement, their expressions resolute, before settling down to rest. Daniel checked the blinking device one last time. Its steady pulse reassured him, a reminder that they weren't alone in their struggle. As he lay back against the rocks, staring up at the stars, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. This strange, desolate world had tested them in ways they never imagined, but it had also revealed their strength. Together, they had proven that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about finding hope. Even in the bleakest of places, the wind whispered through the cliffs, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. And as the group drifted off to sleep, their dreams were filled with visions of home, whether it was Earth or a distant planet beyond the stars. Document. Part 4. The aftermath of the sandstorm left the group battered and weary, but they refused to let despair take hold. The desert stretched endlessly before them, its golden waves now reshaped by the wind into unfamiliar patterns. Sand clung to their clothes, their skin, and even their equipment, making every movement feel heavier. Yet, despite the chaos, there was a sense of unity among the Ma's shared determination to survive. Daniel led the way as they trudged forward, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of water or shelter. He carried a renewed sense of purpose, driven not just by his own survival instinct, but also by the trust the aliens had placed in him. Zixel walked beside him, his tall frame stooped slightly under the weight of responsibility. Viren followed, closely, clutching the blinking device like a lifeline. While Lyra brought up the rear, her injured arm cradled protectively against her chest as they moved. Daniel noticed something unusual, a faint glimmer on the ground ahead. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, but as they drew closer, the shimmer resolved into a small pool of water nestled between two large rocks. It wasn't much, just a shallow puddle, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope. Daniel knelt beside it, dipping his fingers into the cool liquid. He tasted it cautiously, finding it clean and fresh. Turning to the others, he gestured excitedly, pointing to the water and mimicking drinking motions. The aliens reacted with cautious optimism. Lyra stepped forward, kneeling beside Daniel to examine the pool. She cupped her hands and scooped up some water, savoring the sensation of moisture on her parched lips. Zixel remained wary, inspecting the area carefully for any signs of danger. Viaren, ever the problem solver, began gathering materials to create a makeshift container, using scraps of metal from the wreckage and strips of fabric from their clothing. While the others focused on collecting water, Daniel took a moment to study the surroundings. The rocks that sheltered the pool formed a natural basin, suggesting that rainwater might occasionally collect here during rare storms. He pointed this out to the group, drawing simple diagrams in the sand to explain his theory. Though they couldn't understand his words, his gestures conveyed the message clearly. This spot could be a valuable resource. If they needed to return, with their canteens refilled and spirits lifted, the group decided to rest briefly before continuing their journey. They settled into the shade provided by the rocks, shielding themselves from the relentless sun. Daniel watched as the aliens interacted with one another, their body language revealing glimpses of their personalities. Zixol's leadership style was firm but fair, often consulting Viaren and Lyra before making decisions. Viaren's curiosity shone through as he tinkered with the blinking device, trying to repair it despite the odds. And Lyra, though visibly weakened by her injury, radiated quiet strength, offering support whenever it was needed. During the break, Daniel noticed Lyra wincing as she shifted her position. Her bandage had loosened, exposing the wound beneath. Without hesitation, he reached for his first aid kit and motioned for her to sit still. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, allowing him to tend to her arm. As he cleaned and the injury, Lyra watched him intently, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. When he finished, she placed a hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly, a gesture of thanks that transcended language barriers. This small act of kindness seemed to strengthen the bond between them. Lyra smiled faintly, her expression softening. Even Zixol, who had been distant and guarded, appeared less tense. For the first time since their crash, the group felt like a team rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. When the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert, the group resumed their trek. Daniel led the way once more, guided by instinct and experience. He explained his reasoning through gestures, pointing out landmarks and potential hazards. The aliens followed closely, trusting his judgment. Their progress was slow but steady, each step bringing them closer to safety, or so they hoped. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, turning the desert into a frigid expanse. The group huddled together for warmth, sharing the blanket Daniel had brought. Zixol draped an arm protectively around Lyra, ensuring she stayed warm despite her weakened state. Viren sat nearby, fiddling with the blinking device under the dim light of the stars. Daniel observed them quietly, marveling at how far they had come since their initial meeting. Despite their growing camaraderie, challenges remained. Water was still scarce, and the desert offered no guarantees. Hunger gnawed at them, their meager rations dwindling with each passing day. Fatigue weighed heavily on their bodies, slowing their movements and clouding their thoughts. Yet, through it all, they pressed on, driven by a shared will to survive. On the third morning of their journey, Daniel spotted something in the distance, a cluster of structures rising above the dunes. At first glance, they resembled ruins, their weathered forms barely visible against the sandy backdrop. His heart raced with excitement as he pointed them out to the others. The aliens exchanged hopeful glances, their steps quickening as they approached the site. When they reached the ruins, they discovered remnants of an ancient settlement, stone walls partially buried in sand, fragments of pottery scattered across the ground, and carvings etched into the rock. Daniel examined the carvings closely, recognizing symbols that hinted at human presence centuries ago. He turned to the aliens, explaining his findings through gestures. Though they couldn't understand the specifics, they grasped the significance. This place had once been home to life, and where there was life, there was often water. Viren immediately set to work exploring the ruins, searching for hidden chambers or underground reservoirs. Lyra assisted him, her sharp eyes spotting details others might have missed. Zixel stood guard, keeping watch for any signs of danger. Daniel joined the search, his geologist instincts guiding him toward promising locations. After hours of digging and probing, their efforts paid off. Viren uncovered a narrow opening in the ground, leading to what appeared to be a collapsed well. Excited whispers passed between the group as they gathered around the discovery. Using tools improvised from wreckage and stone, they worked together to clear the debris, widening the opening until they could peer inside. The sight that greeted them was worth every ounce of effort. A deep shaft filled with damp earth and the faint sound of dripping water. Daniel lowered a rope into the shaft, attaching a bucket fashioned from part of his backpack. When he pulled it back up, the bucket was brimming with clear, cool water. Cheers erupted from the group, their voices blending harmoniously in celebration. For the first time in days, they felt a glimmer of hope as they drank deeply from the well. Daniel reflected on their journey. What had started as a chance encounter in the desert had evolved into something greater, testament to the power of cooperation and resilience. Despite their differences, they had overcome adversity together, forging bonds that transcended species and language. The desert had tested them, pushing them to their limits, but it had also revealed their strength. Zixel raised a hand, silencing the group momentarily. He spoke softly, his melodic voice carrying a tone of gratitude. Though Daniel couldn't understand the words, he didn't need to. Sentiment was clear. They had faced the unknown and emerged stronger for it. And as they rested beside the well, surrounded by the ancient ruins, Daniel knew one thing for certain: their survival was not just about finding water or shelter. It was about connection, the ties that bound them together, even in the harshest of environments. Document Part 3. The night in the desert was cold and quiet, a sharp contrast to the blazing heat of the day. The group huddled together beneath the blanket Daniel had provided, their breaths visible in the frosty air. The aliens seemed uneasy, their large eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Daniel sat nearby, his back against a piece of the wreckage, keeping watch. Though he was tired, sleep eluded him. His mind raced with thoughts about what lay ahead. Zixel remained alert, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't seem to trust this strange world, and Daniel couldn't blame him. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and they were completely exposed. Viren, however, appeared restless. He fiddled with the blinking device in his hands, muttering softly to himself. Occasionally, he glanced at Daniel, as if debating whether to ask for help. Lyra, wrapped snugly in the blanket, leaned against Zixel, her breathing shallow but steady. Her injury still worried Daniel, though she seemed determined to push through the pain as the hours passed. The temperature continued to drop. The aliens shivered despite the blanket, their thin frames ill-suited for the harsh conditions. Daniel noticed their discomfort and rummaged through his backpack again, pulling out an extra layer of clothing. He hesitated for a moment before holding it out to Zixel. At first Zixel shook his head, refusing the offer, but when Daniel insisted, mimicking the act of putting on the garment, Zixel relented. With some difficulty, he managed to drape the oversized jacket over Lyra, who offered a weak smile of gratitude. Despite these small acts of kindness, tension lingered in the air. Zixel's leadership style was rigid, and his constant vigilance made it clear that he didn't fully trust Daniel. Viren, on the other hand, seemed more open to collaboration. He approached Daniel cautiously, holding up the blinking device once more. This time, he pointed to the wreckage, and then to the stars above, making a series of gestures that suggested repairing their communication system. Daniel studied the device closely, recognizing its potential complexity. He shook his head, slowly, signaling that he lacked the knowledge to assist. Viren sighed heavily, his frustration evident. Lyra, sensing the growing unease, tried to bridge the gap. She reached out tentatively, touching Daniel's arm to get his attention. When he turned to her, she pointed to the canteen strapped to his belt and then to herself, miming a drinking motion. Daniel understood immediately. She was asking how much water he had left. He unclipped the canteen and handed it to her, allowing her to examine it. She tilted it slightly, gauging the remaining liquid, and her expression grew somber. She passed it back to Daniel, shaking her head gently. There wasn't enough to last them all for long. Daniel nodded grimly, acknowledging the reality of their situation. He gestured toward the horizon, pretending to walk while pointing to the ground. The message was clear. He intended to search for water at first light. Zixel stepped forward, his posture tense. He shook his head firmly, indicating that splitting up was too risky. Daniel countered by pointing to himself and then to the group, emphasizing that staying put would only deplete their resources faster. After a brief exchange of gestures, Zixel reluctantly agreed, though his expression remained skeptical as dawn approached. The sky began to lighten, painting the desert in hues of orange and pink. The group stirred, stiff from the cold night. Daniel stretched his limbs, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. He checked his supplies, ensuring everything was ready for the journey ahead. The aliens gathered around him, watching intently as he packed his backpack. Zixel spoke briefly to Viaran and Lyra, issuing instructions that Daniel couldn't understand. Whatever, Zixel said. It seemed to bolster their resolve, as both Viaran and Lyra nodded firmly. When the sun finally rose, casting long shadows across the sand, Daniel set off with the group trailing behind him. They moved slowly, conserving their energy as they scanned the landscape for signs of water. Daniel led the way, relying on his experience as a geologist to guide them. He explained his reasoning through gestures, pointing out dried riverbeds and patches of vegetation that might indicate underground moisture. The aliens followed closely, their eyes wide with curiosity and hope. After several hours of walking, they came across a cluster of cacti standing tall against the barren backdrop. Daniel stopped abruptly, his heart skipping a beat. He knelt beside one of the plants, running his fingers along its spiny surface. Turning to the group, he mimed cutting into the cactus and pouring liquid into his mouth. The aliens exchanged glances, unsure whether to believe him. Zixel frowned, clearly skeptical, but Lyra stepped forward, nodding encouragingly. She trusted Daniel, and her confidence seemed to sway the others. Using a small knife from his pack, Daniel carefully sliced into the cactus. A trickle of milky sap oozed out, pooling in the groove he had created. He collected the liquid in a makeshift container fashioned from part of his equipment, filtering it crudely to remove impurities. When he was satisfied with the result, he took a cautious sip. The taste was bitter, but it was drinkable. Handing the container to Lyra, he watched anxiously as she tried it. Her face twisted slightly at the flavor, but she swallowed without complaint, nodding to signal it was safe. Encouraged by this discovery, the group worked together to extract more water from the cacti. Viaran proved surprisingly adept at improvising tools, using fragments of the wreckage to create crude blades. Lyra assisted Daniel in filtering the sap, her nimble fingers working quickly despite her injury. Even Zixel joined in, though his movements were stiff and deliberate. For the first time since their crash, they functioned as a cohesive unit, united by a common goal. By midday, they had gathered enough water to replenish their dwindling supply. Though it wasn't much, it bought them precious time. As they rested in the shade of the cacti, Daniel felt a glimmer of optimism. They had faced adversity and found a way to adapt. The aliens, too, seemed to share his renewed sense of hope. Lyra smiled faintly, her glowing eyes reflecting gratitude. Viaran offered Daniel a tentative pat on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that transcended words. Even Zixel softened slightly, offering a curt nod of acknowledgement. But their triumph was as they prepared to continue their search. A distant rumble echoed across the desert. At first, it sounded like thunder, but the sky was clear, devoid of clouds. Then the ground began to tremble, sending ripples through the sand. The group froze, staring in alarm, as a massive dust cloud appeared on the horizon. It moved rapidly, swallowing everything in its path. Daniel recognized the danger immediately. Sandstorm was approaching, and it was far larger than anything he had encountered before. He gestured urgently to the others, pointing toward the storm and then to the ground, urging them to take cover. Zixel barked orders to his companions, his voice sharp with urgency. Together, they scrambled to gather their supplies. Retreating to the relative shelter of a rocky outcrop nearby, the storm hit with startling ferocity, whipping the air into a frenzy of sand and debris. Visibility dropped to almost zero, and the wind howled like a living thing. The group huddled together, shielding themselves as best they could. Daniel pressed his body against the rocks, bracing against the onslaught. Beside him, the aliens clung to each other, their forms trembling with fear and exhaustion. For what felt like hours, the storm raged on, relentless and merciless. When it finally began to subside, the landscape was transformed. Sand covered everything, burying the wreckage and scattering their belongings. Daniel coughed violently, brushing grit from his face as he surveyed the damage. The aliens emerged from their makeshift shelter, equally disoriented. Their progress had been erased, their hard-won water nearly lost in the chaos. Zixel looked to Daniel, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel straightened, squaring his shoulders. He pointed to the horizon, miming the act of pressing forward. The message was clear. They couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they had come so far. One by one, the aliens nodded in agreement. Together, they began to dig through the sand, salvaging what they could. Each movement was slow and deliberate, born of determination rather than strength. The desert had tested them, pushing them to their limits. Yet, somehow, they endured. And as they regrouped, battered but unbroken, Daniel realized something profound. Survival wasn't just about finding water or shelter. It was about resilience, the ability to adapt, to persevere, and to face the unknown with courage. Document Part 2. The moment Daniel stepped closer to the aliens, the air seemed to crackle with tension. Each side moved cautiously, their actions deliberate and measured. The aliens exchanged glances among themselves, their luminous eyes flickering with curiosity and suspicion. Daniel kept his hands raised, palms open, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. He didn't know much about these beings, but he understood one thing clearly: they were scared, just like him. Zixel, the tallest of the three, took a step forward. His posture was stiff, almost defensive, as if ready to shield his companions at a moment's notice. Vieron, the engineer, stood slightly behind him, clutching the blinking device tightly in his hand. Lyra, the medic, remained near the wreckage, her injured arm cradled close to her chest. She watched Daniel with wide, unblinking eyes, her expression a mix of fear and fascination. Daniel cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said slowly, enunciating each word carefully. He knew they wouldn't understand his language, but he hoped the tone of his voice would convey sincerity. To emphasize his point, he lowered his hand slightly and pointed to himself. "Daniel," he said, tapping his chest. Then, he gestured toward them, raising his eyebrows in question. For a moment, the aliens hesitated. Zixel tilted his head, studying Daniel intently. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and melodic, though incomprehensible to Daniel's ears. It sounded like a series of flowing syllables, each note blending seamlessly into the next. When Zixel finished, he pointed to himself and repeated a single word: "Zixel." Daniel nodded eagerly, recognizing the gesture as an introduction. He pointed to Zixel and repeated the name, mimicking the alien's pronunciation as best he could. Encouraged by this small breakthrough, the others followed suit. Viren tapped his chest and said, Viren, while Lyra murmured her own name quietly. Barely audible over the wind, with names exchanged, the initial barrier between them began to dissolve, though the language gap remained. Daniel tried again, using gestures to communicate. He pointed to the sky, then mimed a falling motion, followed by pointing at the wreckage. The aliens understood immediately. Zixel nodded and gestured toward the ship, shaking his head to indicate it was broken. They couldn't leave, at least, not yet. But Daniel wasn't done. He crouched down, scooping up a handful of sand and letting it trickle through his fingers. Then, he made a drinking motion, pretending to pour water into his mouth. This elicited a visible reaction from the group. Lyra's eyes lit up with understanding, and she quickly joined in, mimicking the same action. She pointed to herself and her companions, then shook her head vigorously, indicating they had no water left. Daniel frowned, feeling a pang of sympathy. He reached for the canteen strapped to his belt and held it up for them to see. The aliens leaned forward, their attention fixed on the container. Slowly, Daniel unscrewed the cap and took a small sip, demonstrating its purpose. Their expressions shifted from confusion to awe, and Zixel extended a hand tentatively, as if asking for permission to examine it. Daniel handed the canteen over, without hesitation. Zixel accepted it cautiously, turning it over in his slender fingers. Viren peered over his shoulder, muttering something under his breath. After a brief inspection, Zixel passed the canteen to Lyra, who took a careful sip. Her face relaxed slightly, the tension in her features easing as the cool liquid soothed her parched throat. When the canteen returned to Daniel, it was noticeably lighter. He smiled, hoping to reassure them that sharing his water was okay, but even as he did, he couldn't ignore the sinking realization that his supply was limited. There was only so much he could spare, and the desert offered no immediate solution. If they were going to survive, they needed a plan, and fast. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became unbearable. Beads of sweat dripped down Daniel's forehead, and the aliens looked equally uncomfortable, their smooth gray skin glistening under the relentless rays. Zixel gestured toward the wreckage, suggesting they retreat to the shade beneath what remained of the ship. Daniel agreed, following them to the makeshift refuge. Once there, the group settled into an uneasy calm. The aliens huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Occasionally, one of them would glance at Daniel, their glowing eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Daniel sat a short distance away, observing them quietly. He noticed how they interacted: Zixel's authoritative demeanor, Viren's analytical focus, and Lyra's nurturing instincts. Despite their differences, they reminded him of human teams he'd worked with before, united by a common goal. After a while, Viren approached Daniel, holding out the blinking device he'd been carrying. He pointed to it, then to the wreckage, making a series of gestures that seemed to suggest repairing the ship. Daniel studied the object curiously, recognizing it as some kind of tool, though its exact function eluded him. He shrugged apologetically, indicating he didn't understand. Viren sighed, his shoulders slumping in frustration. Lyra, meanwhile, busied herself tending to her injury. She tore a strip of fabric from her clothing and wrapped it around her arm, wincing as she tightened the makeshift bandage. Daniel noticed her struggle and rummaged through his backpack, pulling out a small first aid kit. He held it up, offering it to her. At first, she hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, but when Daniel opened the kit and showed her the contents: antiseptic wipes, and ointment, she accepted it gratefully, watching her apply the supplies. Daniel felt a strange sense of connection. Though they came from different worlds, their shared vulnerability created a bond. Survival transcended species. It was a universal drive that bound all living things together. As the afternoon wore on, the group continued to communicate through gestures and improvised signs. Daniel learned more about their situation. A malfunction during their journey had brought them to Earth. and their communication systems were damaged beyond immediate repair. Without outside help, they were stranded indefinitely. In turn, he explained his presence in the desert, drawing pictures in the sand to illustrate his work as a geologist. Despite the progress they made, challenges loomed large. Water remained their most pressing concern. Even with Daniel's canteen, they wouldn't last long in such extreme conditions. And while Zixel maintained a stoic exterior, Daniel could see the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The leader's sharp gaze darted constantly between his companions and the horizon, searching for answers that weren't there. As dusk approached, the temperature began to drop, bringing a chill to the air. The aliens shivered, visibly unused to the drastic change in climate. Daniel retrieved a lightweight blanket from his pack and offered it to them. Zixel accepted it reluctantly, wrapping it around Lyra, who looked particularly frail. For the first time since their encounter, Daniel saw a hint of softness in Zixel's demeanor, fleeting glimpse of compassion beneath his guarded exterior. Night fell quickly, blanketing the desert in darkness. The stars emerged one by one, dotting the sky with pinpricks of light. Daniel marveled at how similar the constellations appeared to those back home, though he wondered if the aliens saw them differently. Perhaps their homeworld had its own night sky, filled with stories and legends passed down through generations. Sitting beside the wreckage, the group shared a quiet moment of reflection. The aliens whispered among themselves, their voices blending harmoniously with the rustling wind. Daniel listened, unable to decipher their words, but finding comfort in the rhythm of their speech. It was a reminder that, despite their differences, they were all part of something greater, vast universe teeming with life and possibility. As exhaustion set in, Daniel realized he had two choices: leave the aliens to fend for themselves, or stay and help them navigate this hostile environment. The decision weighed heavily on him, but deep down, he already knew what he would do. These beings, stranded and vulnerable, had shown him kindness and trust. Turning his back on them now would go against everything he believed in. With a renewed sense of purpose, Daniel settled in for the night, determined to find a way to ensure their survival. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them together. Document Part 1. The sun hung high in the sky, a blazing orb of fire that turned the endless desert into an oven. Sand stretched out as far as the eye could see, golden waves rippling under the relentless heat. It was not a place meant for life, let alone visitors from another world. But today, the desert had unexpected guests. A distant rumble echoed across the barren landscape, growing louder with each passing second. The sound was unlike anything heard on Earth before, a mix of grinding metal and strange, otherworldly hums. Then came a streak of silver slicing through the blue sky, trailing smoke behind it like a comet doomed to crash. The object spiraled out of control, its once gleaming surface now scorched and battered. With a deafening boom, it slammed into the sand, sending up a massive cloud of dust and debris. When the chaos settled, the wreckage lay still, half buried in the dunes. Steam hissed from cracks in the hull, and faint sparks flickered inside the twisted remains. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the ruined craft. They were unlike any humans, their forms slender and tall, with smooth gray skin and large, luminous eyes. Their movements were deliberate but shaky, evidence of both exhaustion and injury. Among them was Zixel, the leader of the group. He stood, taller than the others, his posture rigid despite the pain etched across his face. His role demanded strength, even when hope seemed lost. Beside him stumbled Viaren, the engineer, clutching a small device that blinked erratically. Vron's quick mind had kept him alive during the descent, though barely. Bringing up the rear was Lyra, the medic, her hands trembling as she tried to tend to a gash on her arm. She glanced around nervously, taking in the alien surroundings with wide, fearful eyes. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind sweeping over the sands. This was not where they were supposed to be. Their mission had been simple, a routine training flight near their home planet's moon. Instead, some unknown force had pulled them off course, dragging them light years away from everything familiar. Now, they found themselves stranded on an unknown world, surrounded by nothing but miles of desolate wasteland. "We need water," Lyra said finally, her voice low and strained. Her words carried urgency, though they lacked volume. "If we don't find it soon, we won't last more than a day." Zixel nodded grimly. He scanned the horizon, searching for signs of relief, anything that might offer salvation. But all he saw was emptiness. No trees, no rivers, no shelter. Just sand, stretching endlessly in every direction. Even their meager supplies had been scattered or destroyed in the crash. What little water they had left wouldn't sustain them for long. Viaran knelt beside the wreckage, inspecting the damage. His fingers traced along jagged edges of torn metal, his expression one of frustration. "The ship's beyond repair," he muttered after a few moments. "At least, not without tools or materials. We're stuck here until someone finds us." "Assuming anyone comes looking," Zixel replied sharply. His tone betrayed his growing unease. As much as he wanted to believe help would arrive, the odds felt slim. They were too far from home, too isolated, and this planet, it didn't seem like the kind of place that welcomed strangers, as if on cue. The temperature began to rise, the midday sun intensifying its assault. Beads of sweat formed on their skin, evaporating almost instantly in the dry air. Each breath felt like inhaling fire, and their throats burned with thirst. Time was running out, and they knew it. Unbeknownst to the stranded aliens, they weren't entirely alone. Miles away, a lone figure trudged through the desert, boots sinking slightly into the loose sand with each step. Daniel Harper adjusted the brim of his wide hat, shielding his eyes from the glare of the sun. A geologist by trade, he spent most of his days studying rock formations and mapping uncharted regions of the desert. Today, however, something unusual had caught his attention. Earlier that morning, Daniel had noticed a thick column of black smoke rising in the distance. At first, he thought it might have been a wildfire sparked by lightning, a rare but possible occurrence in these parts. But as he drew closer, the scale of the disturbance became clearer. Whatever had caused the smoke wasn't natural. The ground nearby was scorched, and fragments of metallic debris littered the area. It looked like the aftermath of a crash, but not one involving any aircraft he'd ever seen. Curiosity tugged at him, urging him forward. Something about the scene felt off. The shapes of the wreckage were strange, unlike anything manufactured on Earth. And then there were the track's footprints leading away from the site, impossibly long and narrow. Whoever or whatever had survived the crash was still out there. Daniel hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks. Venturing deeper into the desert without backup was dangerous, especially given how unforgiving the environment could be. Yet, his instincts told him this discovery was important. If he turned back now, he might never know what or who he'd stumbled upon. With a deep sigh, Daniel tightened the straps of his backpack and pressed onward. The footprints guided him like breadcrumbs, winding between dunes and rocky outcrops. Every step brought him closer to the truth, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger than himself. Eventually, the trail led him to the source of the smoke. Crouching behind a ridge, Daniel peered down at the scene below. There, amidst the ruins of the bizarre craft, stood three figures unlike anything he'd ever imagined. Their appearance was surreal, almost dreamlike. For a moment, he questioned whether he was hallucinating from dehydration, but the longer he watched, the more certain he became. These creatures were real. His heart raced as he observed their behavior. They moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones that sounded musical, yet incomprehensible. One of them gestured toward the horizon, pointing desperately at the empty expanse. Another clutched what appeared to be a container, shaking it to reveal only a few drops of liquid inside. It didn't take a genius to figure out their predicament. They needed water. Daniel's mind raced. Should he approach? The rational part of him screamed caution. These beings were clearly not human, and their intentions were unknown. But another part of him, the part driven by curiosity and compassion, told him he couldn't just leave them to die. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. Carefully, Daniel stood up and stepped out from behind the ridge. The movement caught the attention of the aliens immediately. All three turned to face him, their glowing eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. For a moment, nobody moved. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, slowly, Daniel raised his hands in a gesture of peace. He smiled weakly, hoping his body language conveyed goodwill. After a beat, one of the aliens mirrored his action, raising a slender hand in return. It was a small gesture, but it broke the ice. Tentatively, Daniel took a step forward, closing the gap between them, and so, two worlds collided, not with hostility, but with uncertainty, and the shared struggle for survival. Though neither side fully understood the other, they recognized a common thread binding them together: the will to live.